The iron cage sat in the middle of Fowler Ridge and the sun cooked it like a skillet. Inside that cage, a silent mountain man crouched, low wrists, shackled eyes fixed on dust. Sheriff Hank Dorsey stood 10 paces away, one hand on his Colt, waiting for the judge. Claire Whitmore stepped out of the crowd, ring in her fingers, and her voice didn't tremble. She said, "Open the cage." And every man in that square forgot how to breathe. A rope had been promised, a hanging had been whispered, and the town wanted a show. But Claire offered a wedding, right there in the dirt, right there in front of God. The prisoner lifted his head, storm gray, eyes flashing once, and the crowd flinched back. Someone called him a beast, someone called her crazy, and the sheriff smiled like he'd won. Then Claire raised that ring to the light, and the whole town realized she meant it. If you like old frontier stories, subscribe now because this one cuts deep. Quick question for you. Are you taking care of your heart these days? I've ridden through plenty of hard towns and I've seen fear do ugly work. Fowler Ridge was the kind of place that wore law like a clean coat and hid stains underneath. That afternoon, the dust tasted like spent powder and it stuck to every word spoken. Claire had been swallowing that dust for 3 days ever since the stage left her behind. She came from Ohio with one carpetbag, one worn coat, and a promise in letters. The letters were signed by a man named Calvin Mercer, and he wrote like a decent soul. He promised a cabin near a creek, and promised soil so good it could forgive you. Claire believed him because grief makes you reach for any hand that looks steady. She was a widow, and she'd learned that hope is cheaper than food. So she sold what little she had, and she crossed a long country alone. When she reached the valley from the letters, there was no cabin, only empty ground. When she reached the town, there was no Calvin Mercer, only shrugs and sidelong looks. A store clerk said Calvin had been gone 2 months, maybe more, maybe dead. A drunk in a doorway laughed and said mail order promises blow away like ash. Claire didn't laugh back because she'd already paid for that joke with her life. She walked the boardwalk, slow boots, worn, thin eyes, taking measure of every face. She asked questions, and folks answered like they were swatting flies, quick and careless. Then she heard the crowd before she saw it, a low hum like bees in heat. People were pouring toward the square, not for a dance, not for a sermon. They were gathering for a man in a cage, and that's a bad sign anywhere. Claire followed the noise because empty pockets make you brave in strange ways. The square opened up bright and merciless, and the iron cage sat dead center. It was tall enough to shame a man and narrow enough to break his pride. Bars thick as a wrist lock, polished clean like cruelty, was a public service. Inside sat a man with long, dark hair, filthy clothes, and wrists rubbed raw. His shoulders were broad, but he held himself small, like he'd learned punishment well. He didn't pace, and he didn't shout, and he didn't beg the crowd for air. He just stared at the ground, breathing slow, saving strength, like it cost money. A woman beside Claire whispered that he was found in a cave living like an animal. A man behind her said there were bones in that cave, and he liked saying it. Someone else swore the missing Garrett family had vanished near that same mountain cut. Then another voice corrected him and said the bones looked old, years old. The stories tangled together, and the town held on to each one like a warm drink. Claire watched the caged man, and the stories didn't fit what her eyes told her. She'd known cruel men, and cruelty has a shine to it, a quickness in the gaze. This man had no shine, only a heavy stillness like grief had nailed him down. The sheriff pushed through the crowd, badge bright boots, loud confidence louder. Sheriff Hank Dorsey was built like a barrel, and he wore authority like a grin. He told folks to move along, but he didn't really mean it. He liked the circle. Claire asked if the prisoner had water, and the sheriff looked bothered by decency. He said of course, then he told her to step back because it wasn't safe. Claire asked the question that mattered, and her voice carried farther than she expected. "What's his name?" she said, and she watched the sheriff's mouth tighten. The pause was small, but it was loud, and it told her everything she needed. The sheriff didn't know, and the town didn't care, and that's how men die. Claire asked what the actual crime was, not rumors, not fear, not mountain gossip. Sheriff Dorsey said the prisoner was found over Eli Garrett's body, blood on his hands. Claire asked if anyone saw the first move, and the sheriff said it didn't matter. He said the circuit judge would hang him, and the crowd leaned in like it was dinner. That was when Claire's stomach went cold, because she'd seen this kind of law before. Back east, her husband was shot over land, and the law did nothing but blink. Respected men with friends got to keep smiling, and widows got told to be quiet. Now Claire was standing in a different town watching the same sickness wear new clothes. Her fingers found the last valuable thing she owned, her old wedding ring wrapped in cloth. She didn't pull it out to remember love, she pulled it out to buy a future. Only the future she needed right then was not bread, not cloth, not a ticket home. She needed time, and she needed truth, and she needed one hard move that couldn't be ignored. So she stepped to the cage close enough to feel heat radiate off iron. She looked into the prisoner's storm-gray eyes, and she saw a man still in there. Then she turned to the sheriff, lifted the ring to the sun, and made her offer. "I'll marry him," she said, and the square went silent because mercy had drawn first. Claire Whitmore didn't sleep that night in Fowler Ridge. Not the night the stage left her standing in dust with a promise that didn't show up. Not the night she learned a frontier town could be starving for a hanging the way some men starve for whiskey. When she said, "I'll marry him," she felt the whole square tilt like she'd kicked a rotten post. The crowd laughed first, because laughter is how cowards hide their fear. A man yelled she was touched in the head, and a woman hissed she was shameless. Sheriff Hank Dorsey smirked like he'd found a new kind of entertainment. He told her she didn't know what she was doing, and he told the town she was a fool. Claire held the ring higher, and she didn't blink because blinking gives bullies permission. She said the law wasn't a rope and mercy wasn't weakness, and the words sounded strange out here. The prisoner inside the cage lifted his head a fraction, and the storm-gray eyes met hers. That look wasn't threat, it was exhaustion, like a man who'd run out of reasons to argue with fate. Claire swallowed hard because she recognized that kind of tired. It was the same tired she'd carried after her first husband died in a field that should have fed them. You see, Claire hadn't come west chasing romance. She came west chasing a clean start because the East had already taught her the price of staying. In Ohio, she'd been married to a gentle farmer, a man who believed work could fix everything. They had a small claim, a few animals, and a future that was ordinary in the best way. Then men with better guns and louder voices decided that land ought to belong to them. Her husband was shot, and the story got dressed up as an accident because accidents are convenient. The sheriff back home shrugged, the neighbors went quiet, and church on Sunday stayed full. Claire learned a lesson that never leaves you. Law is only as brave as the people who enforce it, and most people aren't brave when bravery costs them friends. So when Calvin Mercer's letters arrived, she read them like they were a map out of a grave. He wrote about a valley tucked under ridges, about a creek that stayed cold in summer. He promised a cabin half-built, and he promised a woman wouldn't be alone out here. He didn't write poetry, he wrote plain, steady words, and plain words can be dangerous, because plain words make you believe. Claire sold what she could, kept what she couldn't bear to lose, and boarded the stage. She carried her old wedding ring as insurance, not sentiment. A woman traveling alone learns to hide her value close to skin. 3 days of dust and jolting wheels later, Fowler Ridge appeared like a mistake on the horizon. A few buildings, a few men leaning on posts, a bell over a saloon door that never stopped swinging. The stage driver set her down, tipped his hat, and rode off like he was glad to be rid of her. Claire asked for Calvin Mercer, and the first answer she got was a shrug. The second answer was a laugh. The third answer was silence, and silence is always the most honest. They pointed her toward the claim Calvin described, a patch of land outside town. Claire walked there under a mean sun boot, sinking in loose dust, heart beating in her throat. She expected to see smoke or fresh-cut timber or any sign a man had been building a life. Instead, she saw empty ground and a wind that didn't care what she'd sacrificed. No cabin, no fence, no Calvin, just a few stones piled in a way that looked like a plan abandoned mid-thought. Claire stood there longer than she should have because she didn't know where else to stand. She could have turned around, begged a ride back east, admitted she'd been fooled. But pride is a stubborn mule, and grief doesn't like to travel twice. So she went back into town because if she was going to starve, she'd rather do it upright. That's how she ended up in the square, staring at a man in a cage. That's how she heard the townsfolk speak about him like he wasn't human. That's how she saw Sheriff Dorsey enjoy the power of keeping a man helpless. Claire asked the sheriff for a name, and he didn't have one. She asked for evidence, and he had gossip dressed as certainty. She asked about a trial, and he talked about the circuit judge like the judge was a storm that would wash the town clean. But Claire had lived long enough to know storms don't wash anything clean. They just move the dirt around. The Garrett name carried weight in Fowler Ridge. You could hear it in the way men lowered their voices and the way women watched from doorways. Eli Garrett was dead, and his brother Wade was the kind of man who'd call revenge a duty. People said the caged man had been found near Eli's body, blood on his hands. People said bones were found in a cave and a missing family and a wagon and a dozen other things. It was a pile of maybes stacked high enough to look like a fact. Claire had seen that trick before. Back home, her husband's killers had hidden behind the same kind of pile. Not enough proof, the law had said, and then they'd gone back to supper. So when Claire held up her ring, she wasn't making a romantic choice. She was making a legal weapon out of the only thing she had left. Marriage meant responsibility, and responsibility meant the sheriff couldn't pretend this was just a nuisance. If she married the prisoner, the town would have to either charge him properly or let him go. And if they hanged him anyway, they'd hang a man who had a wife standing in front of him. That changes the story, even for a town that loves ugly stories. Claire knew that, and that's why her voice didn't shake when she said it. She wasn't offering love. She was offering a chance for truth to catch its breath. And when those storm gray eyes met hers through the bars, Claire understood something else too. Whatever that man had done, he was already half dead from being treated like a thing. If nobody stepped in, the rope would finish what the cage had started. Sheriff Hank Dorsey didn't like losing in public. He liked badges, he liked keys, he liked a crowd that nodded when he spoke. And Claire Whitmore had just turned his town square into a courtroom without walls. The iron cage behind her hissed with heat, and the prisoner inside it stayed still. That stillness bothered the sheriff more than any snarling ever could. Because a snarling man can be framed as a beast. A silent man makes people wonder who the real beast is. Dorsey stepped closer, lowering his voice like he was doing Claire a kindness. "Ma'am," he said, "you don't know what you're poking at." Claire kept her eyes on him, not the cage, because sheriffs feed on attention. "I know what I'm looking at," she said. "I'm looking at a man held 3 weeks with no name, no hearing, and no mercy." The sheriff's smile thinned. "This is Fowler Ridge," he said. "We handle our own." That line earned a murmur from the crowd, the kind of murmur that says, "Yes, that's right, we're special." Claire heard it, and she heard the danger underneath it. Towns like this don't just punish strangers. They punish anyone who threatens the story they tell themselves. A tall man shouldered forward, clean shirt, tight jaw, eyes bright with grief and spite. "That's my brother's blood," he said, and his voice cracked on the word blood. Wade Garrett. Claire hadn't known his name until that moment, but she felt the weight of it. Garrett names carried a pull in this town like gravity. "That creature murdered Eli," Wade said, pointing at the cage like it was a target on a fence. Claire didn't flinch at the word creature, but she stored it away. People who dehumanize fast harm fast. "Were you there, Mr. Garrett?" she asked, and she kept it plain. Wade's nostrils flared. "I didn't have to be," he snapped. "We found Eli not 50 yards from that cave, and we found him standing over the body. Blood on his hands." Claire nodded once slow. "Did anyone see the first move?" she asked. "Any witness see your brother draw or strike or threaten?" Wade's mouth twisted. "In the mountains there ain't witnesses," he said. "The only witness is that thing in the cage, and he won't talk." What innocent man won't talk? The crowd hummed again, pleased to have logic that fit their fear. Claire turned toward the prisoner. He'd lifted his head now just enough for his face to catch the light. Weeks of beard, sharp cheekbones, a bruise dried dark at his temple, and those storm gray eyes focused, aware, not wild. He was listening to every word. He understood the charge, and he understood the hatred. Claire felt her throat tighten, because she'd been accused before too. Not of murder, but of being a nuisance widow, a woman who wouldn't stop asking questions. Sometimes, the crime is simply refusing to bow your head. Sheriff Dorsey leaned in again, louder, now performing for the circle of faces. "He killed Eli Garrett," the sheriff said, "and the circuit judge will hang him. That should settle it." "Settle it," Claire repeated, and she let the words taste bitter. "You mean bury it before the truth has a chance to breathe?" The sheriff's face reddened. "You want truth," he barked. "We got truth. Bones in that cave and the wagon of a family that went missing last winter." Claire heard the way the crowd latched onto that. Missing family, women and children. That's the kind of story folks use to justify anything. Claire stepped closer to the bars, close enough that some women gasped. She kept her voice gentle because gentleness can cut deeper than shouting. "Sir," she said, "did you harm that family? Did you harm the women and children?" For a long moment the square held its breath. Then the man shook his head. Slow, firm, undeniable. The chains gave a dull clink that sounded like thunder far off. "He didn't speak," Claire said to the crowd, but he answered, "and I'm choosing to believe him over a pile of rumors." Wade Garrett surged forward, rage snapping his restraint. "He's lying," Wade shouted. Two men grabbed his arms because even his friends knew violence could start quick. Sheriff Dorsey lifted his hands for calm, but his eyes were sharp with satisfaction. He liked a crowd on the edge. It made him feel necessary. Claire turned back to the sheriff and her voice hardened. "You said bones," she said. "Old bones, years old, you admitted it yourself. A wagon can be stolen, traded, abandoned. A man can be found near a body and still not be guilty of murder. That's not proof, Sheriff. That's a story you're using as a shortcut to a rope." The sheriff's jaw worked like he was chewing nails. "Where you come from don't matter," he said. Claire's eyes didn't leave his. "Where I come from matters plenty," she answered, "because I come from a place where respected men killed my husband, and the law blinked. And I'm not watching that happen again, not in a different costume." The crowd shifted. Some faces went ugly, some went uncertain. Claire saw it, that split that always appears when someone speaks truth out loud. Half the people want to crush it. Half the people wonder if they've been wrong. Claire didn't need all of them. She only needed a crack. She reached into her carpet bag and pulled out her papers. "A woman traveling alone learns to carry proof like a pistol. Claire Whitmore, widow, 27, of sound mind," she said. "I have the legal right to marry. I'm exercising it." Sheriff Dorsey scoffed, but he looked past her at the crowd. He could feel their attention shifting, and it scared him. "You can't just marry a prisoner," he snapped. Claire lifted the ring again, and she let the gold catch the dying light. "Watch me," she said. A man near the saloon porch spat and laughed. "She's desperate," he said. Claire didn't deny it because desperation is honest. "Yes," she said. "I'm desperate for justice. And I'm desperate to stop you from killing a man because you like the sound of your own fear." That landed like a slap. Even the laughers quieted a little. Sheriff Dorsey raised his voice, trying to regain the square. "Even if I let you," he said, "you'll need a minister. Reverend won't bless this madness." "Then we won't use a minister," Claire said. "We'll do it civil. And you, Sheriff, can perform it unless you're admitting you don't have lawful authority in your own town." The sheriff's eyes flashed. He opened his mouth to answer, but another voice cut through like a rifle crack. "That's enough, Hank." The crowd parted, and an elderly man stepped forward with a cane and a limp. He moved slow, but his eyes were sharp and his presence changed the air. Judge Amos Callahan. Retired, half forgotten, but still a judge in the way he held himself. He'd been watching from a shaded window, and now he came down into the dust. Sheriff Dorsey straightened like a boy caught stealing. "Judge," he began. Callahan lifted a hand. "I heard her," he said, "and I heard you. This young woman has spoken more sense in 10 minutes than I've heard in this town all month." The crowd murmured, surprised to hear an old authority challenge the current one. The judge looked at Claire, and his voice softened only slightly. "You truly intend to marry this man, knowing nothing but rumors?" Claire answered without reaching for pretty words. "I know he's been caged 3 weeks with no trial. I know he's been condemned without a name. And I know what it feels like to lose everything and have nobody believe you." Judge Callahan nodded, once slow. Then he turned his gaze on the prisoner. "And you, son," he asked, "do you consent to this marriage?" The man lifted his shackled hands, chains clanking. With effort, he pressed his palms together and inclined his head. Not a performance, a decision. The crowd went quieter than it had any right to be. Judge Callahan exhaled like something heavy had settled into place. "He consents," he said. "Sheriff, open the cage." Sheriff Dorsey's face darkened, thunderous. "You can't," he started. "I can," the judge said, and his voice carried the old weight of law. "And so can you, Hank, unless you want to explain to the circuit court why you held a man without formal charges, and why you denied a citizen her lawful right to marry." The sheriff's eyes darted across the crowd. He saw the uncertainty spreading. He saw his control slipping. and he hated Claire for it. "Stand back," he barked, and he pulled his keys like he was drawing a weapon. The crowd backed away fast, sudden respect for distance. The prisoner moved to the far side of the cage, slow hands, visible head, slightly bowed. Claire noticed that again. He wasn't challenging anyone. He was surviving them. The lock clicked. The cage door groaned open with a metallic complaint. "Out," Dorsey ordered, slow and easy. The man stepped into the fading daylight. He was taller than Claire expected, broad-shouldered even after weeks in heat and chains. Bare feet, scarred soles, torn clothes that had once been good. His face was angular, jaw strong, beard rough, and those storm-gray eyes held a tired intelligence. Claire stepped forward, and Sheriff Dorsey's hand went to his pistol. "The shackles stay on," the sheriff snapped, "until you're out of my town." Claire didn't argue because she could feel time pressing. She lifted the ring, and her voice turned ceremonial, not because she believed in ceremony, but because ceremony makes witnesses. "I, Claire Whitmore, take this man as my lawful husband," she said, "to have and to hold for better or worse from this day forward." Judge Callahan cleared his throat and turned to the man. "And do you?" he began, then paused, frowning. "For legal purposes, son, what's your name?" The man's mouth opened, then closed. His throat worked like it hadn't formed words in years. He shook his head, once small and frustrated. "He can't speak," Claire said, and she met the judge's eyes. "Does it matter if he understands?" "It matters to paper," the judge muttered, "and paper runs the world more than it should." Claire turned to the man, and her voice softened. "May I give you a name?" she asked, for the law's sake. He studied her long, then nodded once. Claire didn't choose a fancy name. She chose a name that sounded like survival, like something carved from hard years. "Silas Kane," she said. The man's mouth twitched almost a bitter smile, and he nodded again. Judge Callahan lifted his chin and spoke louder for the crowd. "Then do you, Silas Kane, take this woman as your lawful wife?" Silas lifted his shackled hands, pointed to Claire, pointed to himself, and pressed his palms together. The judge nodded. "I'll take that as consent," he said dryly. "By the authority vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife." "God help you both." Claire slid the ring onto Silas's smallest finger because it wouldn't fit anywhere else. Silas curled that hand like he meant to protect it. Sheriff Dorsey leaned in close, voice like gravel. "Now get out of my town," he said. "Both of you. And if he so much as breathes wrong, I'll finish what the judge started." Claire looked at the crowd one last time. "I hope you sleep well tonight," she said, "knowing you were ready to hang a man who couldn't speak to defend himself." Then she picked up her carpet bag, turned her back on the square, and started walking into the dark. Behind her came the soft shuffle of bare feet and the clink of chains and the first fragile sound of a life being pulled out of a cage. Claire didn't look back at Fowler Ridge because looking back pulls you into old cages. The town's boardwalks faded behind her, and the square went quiet again. Only the soft clink of chains followed steady as a bad memory. Silas Kane walked 3 paces behind bare feet, whispering on dust. He kept that distance like it was a rule carved into him. Not close enough to be blamed, and not far enough to be alone. Sheriff Dorsey's warning still hung in the air like smoke you couldn't taste away. Claire felt the ring's absence on her own finger, and she felt it like hunger. She'd traded the last bright thing she owned for a man's chance to breathe. If the town was right, she'd bought herself a grave. If the town was wrong, she'd bought herself a truth, and truth was rarer out here. The road ran toward the foothills, pale and thin under a dying sky. Mountains rose ahead, jagged shapes like broken teeth biting at the horizon. Claire tightened her grip on the carpet bag because fear loves loose hands. She didn't know where she was leading them, but she knew they had to move. A town that wanted a hanging wouldn't sleep easy without one. Behind them, hooves didn't follow yet, but Claire listened anyway. She'd learned to listen for men who decide you're convenient to hurt. Silas's chains clinked again, and Claire hated the sound more than the wind. It wasn't just metal. It was a town's hand still wrapped around his wrists. Claire slowed her pace, and she angled her head back slightly. "Can you keep going?" she asked, and she kept her voice calm. Silas didn't answer with words, but he nodded once controlled and small. He lifted his bound hands a little, then lowered them again. The gesture said yes, but it also said hurry and don't stop near people. Claire understood that kind of warning because widows learn it early. They walked until the last orange light bled out of the sky. When dusk settled, The land changed its tone, and every shadow looked like company. Claire's boots began to ache, and her shoulders burned from the carpet bag. She didn't complain, because complaining is a luxury that doesn't feed you. Silas never once asked for a rest, and that bothered her in a different way. A man who never asks is a man who expects nothing good. Claire didn't want to be the kind of person he expected. Night came fully, and the trail turned treacherous under starlight. Claire found a small cluster of juniper, and she stopped in its thin shelter. "We'll rest here," she said, and she set down the bag with a quiet grunt. Silas halted at the edge of the clearing, still keeping his distance. The firelight that wasn't there yet already seemed to scare him. Claire watched him, and she chose her next move the way you choose a safe step. If she pushed too hard, he'd bolt like a wounded animal. If she treated him like an animal, she'd become Fowler Ridge. So she spoke simple, and she spoke steady. "You can sit," she said, and she pointed to a flat patch of ground. Silas glanced at it, then at her hands, then at the dark beyond. He shook his head and he moved toward the brush without a sound. Claire started gathering deadwood too, because she wasn't about to sit helpless. Wind sighed through juniper needles and coyotes called far off like gossip. Claire carried back branches and she dropped them in a pile with purpose. Silas returned with his own wood, and he stacked it with care. He built a base, then kindling, then angled pieces for airflow. Claire paused, because that wasn't a wild man's work. That was a craftsman's habit, calm and practiced. She pulled a small box of matches from her bag and she held it up. Silas shook his head again and he crouched near the pile. With bound hands, he struck 2 stones together, slow and patient. Sparks jumped tiny and stubborn, and he coaxed them like they mattered. When flame finally caught, he fed it gently, and the fire grew clean. Claire felt warmth spread across her face, and she felt her throat loosen. Fire changes a night. It makes darkness feel less personal. Silas sat back on his heels, watching the flames like they were speaking. His wrist looked raw in the light, and the shackles seemed crueler now. Claire swallowed down anger, because anger burns fast and leaves you cold. She unpacked what little she had and she laid it between them. Hardtack dried beef, a dented canteen, and 1 thin blanket. It looked like a poor offering for a marriage, but it was honest. Silas didn't reach for the food, not right away. He stared at it, then lowered his gaze like he didn't deserve it. Claire pushed the hardtack a little closer, and she nodded at him. "Eat," she said, "because tomorrow won't care if you're proud." Silas took a small piece and he ate slow, like remembering how. Claire watched, and she felt a sting behind her eyes. Not pity, she told herself, just recognition. She'd eaten that way once, back when grief made chewing feel pointless. When they finished, Silas rose without warning and he stepped into darkness. Claire's heart jerked, because loneliness teaches you to expect abandonment. For 3 long breaths, she listened, ready to run, ready to fight, ready to pray. Then he returned with prickly pear fruit cupped in his hands. He knelt by the fire, scraped away spines with a flat stone. He offered the cleaned fruit to Claire, and his eyes stayed lowered. Claire took it carefully, and she bit into sweetness she didn't expect. "Thank you," she said, and the words came out softer than planned. Silas nodded once, and he prepared another piece for himself. They ate in silence again, but the silence felt different now. Not punishment, not threat, just 2 tired people sharing what they had. Claire pulled out a small sewing kit, needle and thread in a tin. "Your shirt's torn bad," she said, and she held up the needle. Silas looked down at the tear, and something like shame crossed his face. He hesitated, then stepped closer to the fire, turning his side to her. Claire worked slowly, careful not to jab him, careful not to startle him. His muscles stayed tense under the cloth as if touch was a trap. Through the tear, she saw old scars, lines, and marks from hard years. She didn't ask how, because questions can be weapons too. "You've survived a lot," she said quietly, and she let it sit. Silas's shoulders shifted a small acknowledgement, nothing more. To fill the night, Claire spoke about what had brought her west. Not because she needed to confess, but because truth builds bridges. "My first husband was James," she said, and her voice caught on his name. "He was gentle, and gentle men don't do well with hungry neighbors. They shot him in the back," she said, and she kept her hands steady. The law called it an accident, and everyone pretended to believe them. Claire stitched another seam, and the fire popped like it was listening. "I sold the farm cheap," she said, "because a widow alone gets cornered. Then I answered Calvin Mercer," she said, "because I needed a door out. And I walked into a town that wanted to hang a man in a cage." Silas turned his head slightly and his eyes flicked to hers. For the first time, he looked at her like she was real. Claire felt it, that tiny shift, like a latch moving inside a lock. She tied off the thread and she held up the mended cloth. "It ain't pretty," she said, "but it'll hold." Silas ran his fingers along the stitches, slow and thoughtful. Then he reached for her carpet bag and he pointed to the handle. The leather was loose and Claire had been worrying it would tear free. She handed him the bag and she watched him work around the shackles. He used his teeth to hold the leather and his bound hands pulled thread tight. His fingers moved with remembered skill, steady and exact. Claire realized then he wasn't built for violence, he was built for making. When he finished, he tested the handle, then handed the bag back. It felt stronger than it had when she left Ohio. The fire burned low and the cold came in close. Claire looked at the single blanket, thin and worn, and she made a decision. "We'll share," she said, and she didn't dress it up. "Out here, propriety won't keep you warm and it won't keep you alive." Silas shook his head hard and he pointed to himself, then the ground. He pulled his knees in, showing how he meant to sleep, cramped and separate. "You'll freeze," Claire said, and she spread the blanket near the fire. "There's room for two if we keep our distance and keep our sense." Silas stood still a long moment. Then he lay down at the blanket's edge. His back faced her and he took up the smallest space possible. Claire lay down too careful and quiet, and she pulled the blanket over them both. The chain clinked softly, and Silas adjusted his wrists with a suppressed flinch. Claire almost reached out, then stopped herself because she'd seen him startle. Instead, she whispered, "Tomorrow we'll deal with those shackles." Silas didn't answer, but his breathing changed slower and deeper. Above them, stars scattered wide, bright and cold, like nails hammered into heaven. A coyote howled and another answered, and Claire didn't feel afraid of them. Wild things out here were honest. They didn't pretend to be righteous. Claire stared at the sky, thinking about the morning, thinking about the miles ahead. She'd married a man who couldn't speak, and a town that wouldn't listen anyway. She didn't know his past, and she didn't know her own future. But she knew one thing, and it settled in her bones like a vow. She wouldn't let fear write the ending, not for him and not for herself. Morning came thin and pale, and it didn't bring mercy with it. Claire woke with dust on her tongue and cold pressed into her bones. The blanket was tucked around her tighter than she remembered doing. For one sharp moment her heart kicked and she sat up too fast. Silas was gone from the fire and the clearing looked wrong without him. Then she saw movement by the rocks, steady and stubborn in the new light. Silas knelt with his wrists held out, working a stone against the shackle pin. He didn't glance up, and he didn't ask for help. The scrape of stone on metal was slow, patient, and relentless. Claire watched the raw skin at his wrists, red and swollen from the chain. She reached for the canteen and she moved careful, like approaching a wounded animal. "Let me tend those," she said, keeping her voice low, keeping it plain. Silas paused just long enough to show he heard her. Then he held his hands out toward her, palms up, and he waited. Claire poured a little water and she cleaned the rubbed skin gently. She used the last of her salve, spreading it thin like rationing hope. Silas's fingers stayed perfectly still, but his jaw tightened once. Claire didn't ask questions, she didn't offer pity, she just did the work. When she finished, she nodded toward the shackle again. "You'll cut yourself up worse if you keep grinding," she said. Silas lifted the stone and tapped it twice, then shook his head. The gesture meant, "No, this is mine, this is how I stay free." Claire swallowed down the urge to argue, and she began breaking camp. Hard-tack wrapped blanket, rolled ashes, scattered because signs draw people. Silas kept filing, and the sound measured the morning like a clock. When the first pin finally loosened, the shackle opened with a sharp click. Silas stared at his freed hand like it belonged to someone else. Then he attacked the second lock with renewed focus, using his free hand now. It went faster, and the second shackle fell into the dust with a heavy clank. Silas flexed his fingers, rolled his shoulders, and breathed like a man surfacing. Then his face changed, hardening with something old and poisonous. He carried the shackles to a rock outcrop, raised them, and struck stone. Once, twice, again and again, until the metal bent and twisted out of shape. It wasn't wild rage, it was targeted, deliberate, like a man killing a symbol. Claire let him have it because some chains need to be broken twice. When the iron was ruined, Silas hurled it into a ravine without looking. He stood still, breathing hard, then he turned back to Claire. The storm in his eyes had eased a fraction, as if a pressure valve opened. "Better?" Claire asked softly. Silas nodded once. Then he surprised her by taking her hand briefly. It was quick, respectful, and full of thanks he couldn't say out loud. Claire felt that touch stay on her skin even after he let go. They traveled through late morning, following the wagon trail into rougher land. Without chains, Silas walked different, longer stride, more sure of his body. He ranged ahead, then returned, keeping Claire in sight like it mattered. The sun climbed and heat rose from rocks in shimmering waves. Claire's boots, worn and too thin, began to punish her with each mile. She stumbled once, caught herself, kept going out of stubborn pride. She stumbled again, and the carpet bag strap bit into her shoulder. The third stumble made Silas stop so fast she nearly ran into him. He pointed to shade beneath an overhang, then to her feet. "Rest," his gesture said, and it wasn't a request. "I'm fine," Claire tried, because women learn to lie about pain. Silas shook his head firmly, and he guided her to the shade. He knelt, and he eased off one boot with careful hands. Claire tensed at the closeness, then forced herself to breathe. Silas examined the blistered heel, then looked up with a quiet concern. He pointed to the boot, made a walking motion, then shook his head again. "I know they're bad," Claire said, "but they're what I've got." Silas held up one finger. "Wait," then he disappeared into brush. He returned with strips of soft bark, and he showed her how to wrap them. When the boot went back on, the pain softened into something manageable. Claire let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Silas nodded, like good work was its own language, then motioned onward. By afternoon the land opened, and Claire's heart lifted against her will. She recognized the shape of the ridges from Calvin Mercer's letters. A valley cupped by hills, cottonwoods, near a cold creek, soil dark at the bottom. Claire stopped on the rise, and she stared down like she was afraid to blink. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the place he wrote about." Silas stood beside her, scanning the valley with narrowed eyes. Claire's hope rose, then crashed, because there was no cabin. No smoke, no fence line, no corral. Just emptiness, and a wind that didn't care what it carried away. "He never built it," Claire said, and the words came out raw. "All those letters, all that talk, and he never built a damn thing." She sat hard on a fallen log, anger and grief tangling like wire. Silas didn't speak, but he didn't look away either. He studied the valley, then he touched Claire's shoulder, gently warning her to look. He pointed toward the creek to a patch of trees that hid something low. Claire squinted, and she saw it, a small structure tucked near the bank. "Is that?" she started, and her voice cracked with cautious relief. Silas nodded, and he led the way down the slope. Up close, it wasn't a cabin. Not yet. Not even close. It was the beginning of a dugout cut into the hillside. Logs framed a front wall, roof beams, half-set doorway, still an open mouth. The work looked abandoned mid-breath, like a man dropped his tools and ran. Claire stepped inside, and her footsteps sounded too loud on packed dirt. The air smelled like earth, and old plans nothing warmed by living. Silas examined the logs with careful hands, pressing joints, testing strength. He frowned at a beam set wrong, and he shifted it slightly. Claire watched, and she saw his body relax in a way it hadn't in town. This place, unfinished as it was, spoke a language he understood. Silas looked at Claire, then he made a building motion with his hands. "You want to finish it," she translated, surprised by the thought. Silas nodded, then he pointed to his hands, flexing his fingers. He pointed to the trees, the creek, the stone outcrops beyond. "Materials," his gesture said, "and skill, and time." "With what money?" Claire asked, and she laughed once, bitter and small. "I've got $17 in a carpet bag, that's it." Silas drew a line in the dirt with his finger, then he tapped his chest. He lifted his chin toward the ridgeline, then back to the shelter. Claire understood the meaning anyway. "We can make something from what's here if we don't quit." Claire wanted to believe, and she hated herself for wanting it. She looked around the half-dugout, and she imagined a door, a hearth, a roof. She imagined a place where a woman could sleep without listening for boots. "All right," she said, and her voice steadied as she spoke. "We'll try." Silas's face shifted and a rare smile eased years off him. It wasn't a wide grin, it was a flicker like sunrise through clouds. He immediately began pacing the space, measuring with his steps. He found a stick, smoothed a patch of ground, and started sketching. A proper roofline, a stone hearth, a door that could bar. His focus was calm, almost peaceful, and Claire felt something loosen in her chest. Then his hand slowed, and the calm drained out of him like water from a cracked bucket. He stared at the drawing as if it turned into something else. His shoulders tightened, and he stood too fast, stepping away from the shelter. Claire followed, careful not to crowd him. "What is it?" she asked. "What's wrong?" Silas pointed back at the dugout, made the building motion again. Then he drew a finger across his throat, sharp and final. He pointed to himself, then covered his face with both hands. Claire's stomach went cold. "Building meant death for you," she whispered, trying to understand. Silas nodded once, and the nod looked like pain. He held up 3 fingers, then pointed toward the creek in the valley. 3, Claire said softly, 3 people. Silas's eyes flicked to her, and he nodded again. He crouched by the creek and picked up stones, arranging them carefully. 1 larger stone, 2 smaller ones, then 1 slightly apart. A man, 2 children, and a woman, Claire guessed, voice barely there. Silas touched the woman's stone, then mimed, cradling a baby. Claire felt the meaning hit her like a fist. "She died bringing life," she said, and her own throat tightened. Silas swept the stones away with a violent motion, scattering them. Then he placed new stones, many stones, circling the small ones. He grabbed a stick and jabbed at the 3 stones, fast and brutal. "Raiders," Claire whispered, "bandits, men who take what they want." Silas touched the larger stone himself, then mimed fighting. Then he touched the 2 smaller stones with a gentleness that didn't belong in this hard world. He covered them with dirt, and his hands shook. Claire's eyes stung, and she didn't wipe them. "Your children," she said, and her voice broke. Silas nodded, head lowered, shoulders bowed under invisible weight. He wasn't finished. He pointed to the dugout again, made the building motion once more. Then he touched his throat, and he mimed a rope tightening. Claire's breath caught. "They tried to hang you," she said. Silas lifted his chin, and Claire saw faint marks at the edge of his beard line. Old rope scars pale against weathered skin. Claire's anger flared hot and bright. "Not for murder," she said, "but for being different, for grieving, for surviving." Silas nodded slowly, then he tapped his throat and shook his head. "That was when your voice died," Claire realized. "Words died with them, and with that rope, and with those years alone." Silas pointed toward the mountains, then made a gesture of time passing. Seasons, snow, Sunday, years. He mimed living small, hunting, hiding, watching. Then he mimed a man approaching, weapon raised. "Tom," she said, "Eli Garrett, he came at you." Silas's nod was firm, and his jaw tightened. "Self-defense," Claire whispered, and it wasn't a question anymore. Silas pressed his palms together once, like he was asking to be believed. Claire stepped closer, slow as sunrise, and she stopped just within his space. "It doesn't have to be the same," she said quietly. "I'm not the woman you lost, and you're not the man you were then. We can build different, and we can go slow, and we can stop if it hurts." Silas looked at her a long moment, storm-gray eyes wrestling with memory. Then he picked up the stick again and returned to the drawing. His hand was steadier this time, and the lines he made were practical, not dreams. A door, a hearth, a roof that would hold snow. Claire watched, and she felt a strange thing bloom inside her. Not romance, not certainty, just a hard, small hope, the kind that survives drought. She nodded, once matching his earlier vow. "We'll build," she said, and she meant the shelter, and she meant themselves. The canyon narrowed like a fist, closing. Red rock walls rose on both sides, trapping sound, trapping breath, trapping choices. Claire rode the old mule to spare her feet, and Silas walked ahead, leading by the rope. He kept glancing back, not at her face, but at the space behind her. It wasn't fear of shadows. It was memory, the kind that remembers men before you hear them. The mule's ears flattened first. Then Silas froze mid-step, shoulders tightening in a way Claire already knew. Hoof beats. Fast. Coming up, the trail behind them, echoing off stone like a warning drum. Silas guided the mule to a wider patch, then stepped between Claire and the bend. His hand went to the knife on his belt, the only weapon they carried. Claire felt her stomach drop, but she slid down from the mule anyway. If trouble was coming, she'd rather be standing than perched. 3 riders rounded the bend. Their horses were lathered, nostrils, flaring eyes hard. The lead man wore a clean hat and a dirty look, like he'd been saving it. Wade Garrett, brother to Eli. Claire recognized him from the square, from the way grief can turn into entitlement. Wade reined in slow, enjoying the moment. Well, now he drawled the beast and his bride. His 2 men spread out, blocking the narrow trail like they owned the canyon. Claire kept her voice steady. "We're going to Cedar Creek for supplies," she said. "We want no trouble." Wade laughed, but there wasn't humor in it. "Supplies," he repeated. "My brother's dead and you think you can shop like it's Sunday." Silas stood calm, shoulders squared, knife hand low, not threatening. But Claire could feel how coiled he was, ready to throw himself in front of her if leads started flying. Wade's eyes stayed on Silas like he was watching a wolf. "Step away from him, woman," Wade said. "This ain't your fight." Claire stepped closer to Silas instead, until her shoulder nearly touched his arm. "I'm his wife," she said. "His fight is mine." One of Wade's men cursed under his breath like courage offended him. Wade's hand drifted toward his gun, slow and casual, practiced. "You got anything to say for yourself, beast?" he asked. "Any last words before I put you down like the animal you are?" Silas didn't speak. He didn't even lift his chin. He just watched Wade with those storm gray eyes, and the silence made Wade angrier. "He can't speak," Claire said. "Not because he's guilty, but because life took his voice years ago." Wade's lips curled. "Convenient," he said. "A man who won't talk, a woman who talks for him, and a town that let you walk away." He leaned forward slightly in the saddle. "Sheriff Dorsey might have played nice, but family justice runs deeper than law." Claire felt the canyon press in heat and stone and hate. She thought of the dugout in the valley, half-built, fragile as a promise. She thought of winter coming and how a single bullet could end everything they'd barely started. Then she saw something flicker in Wade's eyes. Not certainty, not joy, just a thin crack of doubt, like he didn't expect Silas to stand there so still. Silas moved, but not the way Wade expected. He didn't lunge. He didn't reach for the knife. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a leather cord. On that cord hung a tiny carved horse worn smooth by handling. A child's toy. Silas held it up in the sunlight, then pressed it to his chest. He pointed to himself, then mimed, cradling something small. The gesture was simple, but it hit hard. Claire stepped forward half a pace, careful not to provoke the guns. "He lost his children," she said to Wade, voice low but clear. "He knows what it's like to want revenge so bad it burns your throat. But killing him won't bring your brother back. It'll just add more blood to blood." Wade's jaw worked. For a heartbeat, the canyon held still. Then one of Wade's men spoke, quiet but firm. "Marcus," he said, "Eli always was hot-headed. You know that." Wade snapped his gaze to the man. "You taking their side." "I'm saying the truth matters," the man answered. "Eli went up those mountains looking for someone to blame for his troubles. If he drew first, then this ain't as clean as you want it." Wade's hand tightened on his gun, then loosened. His eyes went back to Silas, and he saw the toy horse again, saw the way Silas held it like a wound. Silas lowered himself to one knee in the dust. Not begging, not surrendering, acknowledging. He drew in the dirt with a finger. 2 figures facing, one falling. Then he covered his eyes with both hands. "I didn't want it," the gesture said. "I didn't celebrate it, but it happened, and I'm sorry for the pain it caused." The apology wasn't for guilt. It was for grief. Wade stared down at him, and the rage on his face fought with something older. He swallowed hard. "Get up," he said, rough. "Get up, damn you." Silas rose slowly, keeping his hands visible, keeping his body calm. Wade exhaled like a man letting go of a heavy stone he'd been carrying. "I ought to kill you," he muttered. "I ought to end this right here." His gun hand hovered, then dropped. He looked at Claire, and his voice turned colder, but it wasn't a threat anymore. "You two stay out of my family's way," he said. "You stay in that valley you keep to yourselves, and we understand each other." Claire nodded once. "We want peace," she said. "That's all we've wanted since the day I stepped off that stage." Wade's mouth twisted. "That valley you're on, Mercer's old claim," he said. "My brother had his eye on that land. That's probably why he went up there in the first place. He shook his head like the admission tasted bitter. "Just watch yourselves," he added. "Not everyone will stop like I'm stopping." Then Wade turned his horse, and the three riders moved past them, hooves striking stone echoing away. When they disappeared around the bend, Claire realized she'd been holding her breath. Silas sagged slightly, tension draining out of him in one long exhale. He touched the spot under his shirt where the carved horse rested, then he looked at Claire. His eyes said thank you, and his shoulders said, "I almost died again." Claire reached for his arm, just a light touch, not grabbing, not claiming. "You did the brave thing," she whispered. "You showed him you're human, even when he wanted you to be a monster." Silas didn't nod this time. He simply turned, took the mule's rope, and led them forward through the canyon. And for the first time since Fowler Ridge, the road ahead felt like it might actually lead somewhere. Cedar Creek showed up at noon, a tight little town with boardwalks shining and eyes already waiting for them both. Claire kept her chin level, but her stomach knotted because stories travel faster than wagons on dry trails out here. Silas walked beside the mule, hands open, shoulders narrow, acting smaller than he was, like safety required, humility every day. At Henderson's store, the bell rang sharp and the clerk stared hard until Claire laid silver down calmly, right there. She asked for nails, flour, salt, and a saw, and she spoke like a woman buying winter, not gossip today. Silas stood by the door, quiet as a post, watching hands, watching exits, refusing to give fear a target again. A freight wagon overturned in the street, barrels rolling, a driver pinned, and men shouting nonsense over each other loudly. Silas dropped the bundle, ran in, and pointed with authority, using gestures to place bodies where leverage mattered most today. He set a plank under a wheel, nodded for timing, and the wagon rose just enough to pull the man. When the driver was freed, bruised but breathing, the crowd went quiet, and respect replaced a slice of fear inside. Claire saw women watching from doorways, and she saw men nod at Silas, like he belonged to work after all. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, offered wages for 3 days weekly, and Claire answered, without begging or smiling too much. Silas nodded once, and that nod carried more promise than any letter Calvin Mercer ever mailed across states to her. Outside, a small girl approached the mule, penny in hand, brave in the way only children can be at dusk. Silas knelt, pulled a tiny wooden bird from his pocket, and offered it like a quiet apology for fear itself. The girl's mother hesitated, then thanked him, and that simple thanks traveled through town like a clean wind at last. On the ride home, Claire said he changed something, and Silas only touched the toy horse undershirt and breathed. 2 months passed, boards straightened, roof tightened, and the dugout became a cabin that could face snow without bowing once. Silas rode to town for work, silent but steady, and Claire used his pay to stock winter goods each week. Wade Garrett appeared one afternoon, hat low voice, quieter, admitting greed led his brother up that canyon in the first. He mentioned a name, Jonah Brennan, a blacksmith who lost family, and Silas went still as stone under sun glare. Claire didn't press him then because some truths need heat and time, not a knife of questions to open safely. That night Silas rode in dirt. Jonah died with them, and Jacob was never his burden anymore. Claire nodded slowly. Winter slammed down early, wind shaking eaves, and the valley turned white, quiet and unforgiving for any weak promise left. One evening, hooves came fast, and an old doctor arrived supporting a pregnant woman near collapse in blowing snow hard. Claire opened the door wide, and Silas moved without words, stoking fire, boiling water, laying cloths like he'd trained before. The woman said her name was Sarah Winters, and she begged for help because the baby came early too soon. The doctor spoke calm directions, and Claire followed them, hands steady, refusing panic the way she refused pity for years. Silas stayed near the corner, eyes haunted, then stepped in when Sarah's strength faltered, offering his shoulder without being asked. Claire noticed his fingers touch the toy horse, and she knew this room stirred an old wound that never closed. Wind screamed outside, but inside there was only breath, lamplight, and the hard work of life coming anyway now. When the baby arrived, a healthy girl, Sarah cried with relief, and Claire felt tears. She didn't hide at all. Silas stared at that child, grief and wonder mixing, and he whispered, "You're safe now," to Sarah, so she heard. The doctor looked up, surprised, because words from Silas were rarer than rain in late summer on this side here. After Sarah slept, Silas sat by the fire, carving scrap wood with patience that felt like prayer for lost years. By dawn he set down a cradle plain and sturdy, and he placed it near heat as if guarding hope. Claire watched him, and she didn't touch because she'd learned touch can spook grief back into hiding like a snake. Silas met her eyes and his throat worked. Then he forced one sentence through rust and pain to stay human. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, and the cabin seemed to breathe easier like it believed him this time. Claire nodded and she answered quietly, "We'll keep building, because that's how you honor the living and bury the dead." Next week in Cedar Creek, men tipped hats and women nodded because skill had rewritten the old legend for them. Silas lifted crates at Henderson's fixed broken harness and never once bragged, letting work speak first every single day too. Claire used town trips to trade eggs, buy lamp oil, and learn which neighbors carried kindness when nobody watched close. She also learned which men still wanted a hanging, and she learned their names like weather signs before storms came. Silas never entered a saloon, not once, because loud rooms revive old ropes and old judgments in a heartbeat fast. Instead, he walked home early, checking tracks, checking sky, protecting Claire with quiet choices. Nobody applauded, but she noticed always. When spring finally teased the ridge tops, Claire planted a small garden, and Silas built a corral from river stones. They worked side by side, not sweet, not easy, but honest. And honesty is what lasts out west for sure. Some nights Silas still woke sweating, and Claire sat by the hearth saying nothing, staying present until his breathing slowed. She didn't try to fix him because broken men aren't fixed, they're rebuilt one nail at a time with steady hands. In town, Judge Callahan heard the new tales, and he smiled because law finally sounded like decency on dusty streets. Sheriff Dorsey pretended it was his idea, yet he avoided Claire's eyes because she'd stripped his power down to truth. Wade Garrett never returned, but his warning stayed, and Silas kept a rifle close just in case winter came again. Claire sometimes wondered about Calvin Mercer. Then she laughed at herself, because empty men don't deserve thought after what he did. The cabin smelled of pine and smoke, and the cradle waited, reminding them life can start over even after ruins. On the first warm Sunday, Sarah Winters visited baby bundled, and she called Silas a good man without any fear. Silas didn't answer with speeches, he just fixed her wagon strap and smiled for half a second, then looked away. Claire stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, thinking how one ring bought two futures, not one, and that mattered. If you've ever been judged by silence, you know this story, and you know why mercy is muscle, not myth. So tell me, would you have opened that cage, or would you have let the town write death tonight anyway?